Hi there, I'm Dr Kelli McGraw, and today I'm here talking to Dr Jennifer Alford about the Genre Curriculum Cycle, otherwise known as the Genre Pedagogy Cycle.
Yes, that's right.
Before we get started, we need to clear up one thing, and that is, when we're talking genre, are we talking westerns? Are we talking romances? Tell me. No.
Okay, so they are literary genres.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have our westerns, our romance, our horror. But in this particular case, we're talking about text types, or what we call genres. So they're typical ways of creating a piece of writing or speaking.
Well, lay it on me. Tell me more about the Genre Curriculum Cycle.
Okay, so the Genre Curriculum Cycle is a pedagogical tool that teachers can use to teach students how to shape, create a new genre. Okay, so a genre might be a narrative in English, or an exposition, an analytical exposition, or a poem, a film review, or something like that. So the pedagogic principle underpinning this particular cycle is that students need explicit instruction in how to craft this new genre. Okay, so it grew out of a number of teachers in New South Wales actually thinking about their learners and how some learners knew kind of like, you know, naturally, almost by osmosis, how to do genres, whereas other students didn't. So there was a project called the Disadvantaged Schools Project who took up this notion of genre as an explicit teaching approach and created a model. And so this particular cycle is a pedagogical tool that teachers can use to teach genres.
You've got the picture there, and you've got it right there. We are looking at it, and we're going to show it up on the screen as well. Talk me through the big phases that we're looking at in this wheel.
Okay, so the tool itself is a wheel, and so you actually do need to sort of have it in your hand to turn it so you can read the instructions on it. But it's very helpful for teachers because every chunk of the wheel or phase of the wheel has specific prompts that a teacher can use to guide them through it. Mm-hmm. Now, before I explain the wheel, I will say that it doesn't mean that a teacher has to start at the beginning and end at the end.
That was my first question when we were doing the pre-interview.
Yes.
Was, so where do I start, and is that a rule?
It's not a rule.
Yeah.
Okay, there's some general guidelines about where to start, but in fact a teacher can, on the basis of knowing her or his students, can decide where to come in on the pedagogical wheel tool to make the genre explicit to their students. But let's say you're teaching a brand new genre to your average classroom's group of students. What you might do is decide to begin at the negotiating the feel stage, which is here at the top of the diagram. So the negotiating the feel stage is where you start to talk to students about the nature of this genre. Have they had any experience with this genre? You know, say for example you're doing a multimodal speech, which I'll talk you through later as an example. Where do we see multimodal speeches in our everyday life? So you're always bringing it back to the everyday experience of the field. From that basis, you'll start to negotiate with students what kinds of experiences they've had with that particular genre. Was it a positive experience? What was the purpose of their experience with that particular genre? And then that will lead you into the next phase, which is where you start to deconstruct it as a social and cultural artifact. So there's two things about deconstruction, and that's the next phase of the model in the wheel. You need to think about where that genre sits in relation to a broader cultural milieu. So you're talking about, well, what is the social purpose of this genre? Why do we have it? Why does it exist? If we were to move to a different country in a different time frame, this situation might not be possible. So every situation sits within a broader cultural and socio-cultural context of what's possible around communication. Within that, though, you have a specific situation, and that's where the register variables come in. And this particular tool can help demystify what we call register variables. So the register variables are part of the context of situation, and we have three variables. The first is subject matter. So whatever it is that you're writing about or speaking about, you have to have a topic, clearly. Our topic here today is the Genre Curriculum Cycle. So all of our language that we're using, the vocabulary and the grammar, is geared towards talking about that topic. So we have field, which is subject matter. Then we have the tenor, or the roles and relationships. So you and I have a particular relationship here. We're peers, we're colleagues, we're equal. In a different situation, I might have more power than you, or you might have more power than me, and so that relationship will impact on the kind of language that we use. We have different roles to play as well. I'm the speaker, you're the hearer, and sometimes you're the speaker and I'm the hearer. So that impacts on the situation. And the third dimension is the mode. So typically you've got a written mode or a spoken mode, but in speaking you can have face-to-face speaking, or you can have not face-to-face speaking. And then you've got this strange thing called email, which is kind of like speaking, but it's not really like speaking. It's writing. So we've got these hybrid sorts of modes as well that are emerging too with technology. So that's field, tenor and mode, and they're all part of this situational context within which we communicate. And combined, those things are called the register.
Lovely. You know, it always comes up when we're talking about register in class. The understanding a lot of students come in with is that it's about whether it's informal or formal language, and that's where a lot of people start at. So being able to break that apart and say, well, it's not about formal or informal, it's about knowing who your audience is and deciding what your role is and what language you need to activate for that particular situation, for that context of situation.
Yes, that's right.
So getting beyond just informal, formal and thinking about it more complexly.
That's right. So I think the informality of language is one part of the register variables, and it's to do with the tenor or the roles and relationships that we play in communicating. But it's certainly not the only part of what we call register. So that's part of deconstruction. The next part of deconstruction is what we call the text modelling phase, where you will actually show a number of different examples of, say, a multimodal speech, and students will be encouraged to explore them for their different text structure, the different language features, to make those things explicit. Now that can be done with the teacher guiding and directing students through that process, depending on who your learners are. Or the teacher could set up a whole classroom with different stations, with different examples of the text that the teacher wants them to explore, and the kids can go for it with more of an inquiry model. So there's different ways to do that. It's not lockstep.
One of the things we were talking about earlier was that yes, you could come into a unit at that text point, you know, kind of launch with the texts as a hook, but one of the true crimes that I see in a lot of pre-service teacher assignments is where they just start with the text and never go back to building the field or talking about the context.
Exactly.
They just say, right, we're now reading To Kill a Mockingbird, you've got 2 weeks, read it, and jump straight to the next part of the wheel.
And maybe straight into, okay, we're going to write a review about To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yes.
No, well, that's true. I mean, I think teachers have to be far more aware of what their learners' needs are beyond the classroom, and also more creative. So you would definitely be wanting to move away from that approach. It might be a safe approach to begin with as a teacher, but eventually you'd want to be doing some really interesting building of the field and thinking about the purpose of that genre overall.
Great. So you've got there the building the field, deconstruction, and then your 2 next big chunks are where you do joint construction and independent. All
right, so the deconstruction phase can take quite some time. If you're really doing that thoroughly and you want to engage students in exploring the model texts, and you can use texts that aren't such a good example as well to get the students to suggest improvements, then you're going to move into joint construction, and that's where you'll work with students to prepare their own, but with you as a guide, with more competent students as guides, or in fact with outside experts as guides, depending on whatever genre you want them to produce. So this is where you're really bringing in, what Vygotsky would say are your more knowledgeable others, people who know stuff about their genre. And so students work with them to jointly construct one as a whole, as a class or as a group. And that enables students to dialogically reflect on the nature of the genre, on the structure of the genre, of the language features, which features work. Why doesn't that language feature work here? Let's go back to our social and situational context of the genre and bounce the language off the sociocultural dimensions that underpin the genre. And that takes a fair bit of skill as a teacher, and you have to know your grammar to do that. You have to know your language and how it fits with literacy. So you'll do lots and lots of joint construction of different samples of the target model or the target genre, before you then release students off to do it themselves in the independent construction phase, which is largely then assessed.
And we kind of fell back, I certainly fell back on an Englishy example then, but this isn't just the work of English teachers, is it?
No, not at all, not at all. We know that literacy is a capability that we have to develop across the curriculum. And so this kind of teaching can be used in absolutely every subject area. You can do it in history when you're doing, an historical description, or some, parts of a depth study can draw on this model. Science reports, this particular pedagogical tool can be used from prep to grade 12 and across every subject area.
So my on-the-fly question that might not land, okay. In terms of planning your teaching and learning experiences, something that I come back to in English is that oftentimes people will design a unit where they do a really strong study of a text, or they create a text and the energy goes there, but they sometimes don't get the split right. So for example, when I look at this cycle, I think, well, in English, would you have to apply it to both the text you're studying to understand its genre, as well as the text you need to produce to understand its genre? So you almost in an English unit would have 2 genre curriculum cycles for each?
Yes, you could, in fact, that's true. But the trick is to blend those together.
Yeah.
So you're moving towards creating a particular genre for, say, assessment. And in the meantime, you're looking at the genre that's being studied, for example, the plays or the poems or the novel. So you have to have those two things running in tandem. And I think that's where building the field or negotiating the field is important. Now, the diagram itself has all these arrows that sort of interloop, and it gets a little confusing by looking at the arrows. But the arrows actually represent that very fact, that you are kind of travelling across 2 planes, if you like, at the same time. Building their knowledge of the novel, say it's Pride and Prejudice or, Cat's Eye by Margaret Atwood. You're looking at the novel itself as a genre, but you're also then leading students toward creating the particular genre, the multimodal speech, for example, that's required for assessment. So it's a little bit of both, it is.
Yeah. So I think it can sometimes be double tricky for English teachers because we do text studies.
Yes.
But having said that, every single teacher engages in assessment, and every single assessment piece will be in a genre.
That's correct.
So we have that extra complexity in English, but every teacher across the curriculum is dealing with assessment genres all the time.
That's right. The other thing to note about the wheel is all the arrows point into the centre, where it says approximation to control of genre. And that's the key, is that any explicit pedagogical tool is always working towards building students' knowledge of controlling a genre. It may not be perfect mastery, but that's part of the process of learning to create different genres.
And to go back to the idea of being in a box, it's that old, adage that you have to know the rules before you can break the rules, right? So that can be helpful for even being creative and getting out of the box. Making new genres. You're allowed to make new genres.
That's correct. And some assignments actually require students to subvert genres. But in order to subvert a genre, you probably need to know what it might have looked like, in its prototypical kind of form. And then you can playfully, creatively subvert that. Yes. So you can definitely work towards that with this particular model as well.
So you mentioned before that the curriculum cycle came out of that Disadvantaged Schools project. What is it about this kind of work that would be relevant to disadvantaged schools or students who are struggling to, make it out there in the world?
Okay, that's a really good question, actually. So what a lot of teachers were finding were that there were students in schools who were maybe from a lower socioeconomic background, who hadn't had exposure to a lot of different genres and types of writing and speaking, students from second language backgrounds who were new to English. So the idea was that we create a pedagogical tool that enabled teachers to make these genres explicit for equity purposes. So all students were on a more of a level playing field. In terms of assessment in particular.
Which does make a lot of sense to me. So sometimes around genre, the criticism that I've heard is the idea that teaching people how to do a genre a certain way kind of puts them in this creative box, but you don't exactly see it that way.
Well, from an equity position, if you don't know how to write a genre, but you're being assessed on it, then it's pretty unfair.
Yep.
So to make it a more level playing field, this particular genre pedagogical cycle or this tool can help teachers to make it explicit for everybody, which doesn't mean that those who already know it can't be extended, but at least it makes sure that every student in the room has a clear understanding of the expectations.
So genre curriculum cycle sounds pretty specific. How might it relate to some of the other things that new teachers are learning about pedagogy?
So for me, the genre curriculum cycle is actually a particular way of mobilising a gradual release of responsibility approach to teaching. So I remember when I was going through school way back in the 70s and 80s that there was an assumption that students would know how to do things, and that responsibility was very much on the student to just know how to do things. Whereas this particular model says, well, hang on, not all kids know how to do that. So teachers and more knowledgeable others need to be able to gradually release that responsibility through scaffolding, through bedding down, key core principles at the beginning that allow students to take that up then and run with it. So we are working towards autonomy and more independent practice, but it comes with guidance. And I guess because of my background in teaching English as a second language learners, I know how critical that knowledge is, that gradual release of responsibility. And all learners will require different types of gradual release and different timings. So some students will come in and not need a lot of hand-holding at the beginning. They'll be able to run with it, and that's fantastic. We want them to do that. But other students will need a lot more, a slower approach to that gradual release of responsibility until they've mastered the genre.
I think about it as, when someone tries to teach me how a car engine works, and I'll be standing there next to my sibling who just says, oh, it will pick it up a lot more naturally to me, and I really need them to say, now hang on,
there you go,
show me that again,
yes,
explain that one more time, and that's the analogy I go to.
Perfect, that's a perfect example.
Well, thank you so much for your time in the interview today. I know that for me, coming to genre pedagogy as a newbie a few years ago, it did feel like getting put in a box, and it just doesn't feel like that anymore. And so thank you for sharing your knowledge about how the cycle works with us today.
My pleasure, Kelly.